America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Alfredo Ortiz, CEO of Job Creators Network.
You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we are joined by Karol Markowicz. Karol is a columnist at the New York Post and Fox News and author of the best-selling book, Stolen Youth, How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. She also hosts a podcast, The Karol Markowicz Show. Karol was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in Brooklyn, and she now lives in South Florida with her husband and 3 children. Karol, welcome to Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Well, I'm born in the Soviet Union and came to Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn. Tell us about your background. What was life like? Just so curious.
I was born in Russia. My father's from Ukraine, and my parents met when they were both sent to work in Turkmenistan. So I have sort of a range of places in my history. They came to Brooklyn in the late 70s, and I was a little under 2 years old. And I was raised in New York. I was raised in kind of an immigrant enclave in Brooklyn. And I really felt like a New Yorker. I mean, I thought that was a very standard way to grow up. And I loved it. It was really a fantastic childhood, I thought.
Do you still have family in Russia?
I have family in both Russia and Ukraine. My family in Ukraine is displaced right now in Germany, but I have family in both, yes.
Okay. Have you ever gone back to visit?
I never went back. It's funny because my parents are both major travelers. As soon as we got to America, they wanted to see the world. My first trip ever outside the country was to Venezuela. I've been to really off the beaten path places with my family. But Russia and just the former Soviet Union countries, we have felt very like other immigrant people come to the U.S. and maybe they refer to it as, back from where they came from as my country, or I go back to my country or any of that. It's not like that when you leave somewhere like the Soviet Union. We celebrate every year the date that we came to America. It's a really big deal in my family, our Americaversary. We don't have that kind of warmth for the place of my birth. And, so no, I've never been back. I'm curious about it only because I do still have family. I have cousins there, and I'd love to kind of see where they live and how they live. But in general, our family just has such a kind of negative feeling towards the whole place that we've never been back.
I like that term, by the way, Karol, Americaversary.
Yeah, we celebrate it every year. I tend to write a column about it every year, just about different lessons that I've learned along the way. I've been in America, obviously the great majority of my life, but there's some definite feelings of, I feel like an immigrant a lot of the time. I feel like I get to be this open patriot, because I know where else life could have taken me. And that celebration every year, it's really important. July 20th, every single year, it's like a big deal. And, just to commemorate the fact that we got to be free.
It's funny, Karol, why I go around the country talking to small business owners. A lot of them are immigrants. And whenever I talk to immigrant small business owners, they're so appreciative of this country and what it's done for them and the opportunity that it's presented. I kind of think that we should have some kind of like a export program of people from the left that complain about our country all the time, so they can actually really see what a bad country really is, right? And send them to a socialist country. Because
Absolutely.
It's amazing how immigrants, I mean, my parents were immigrants, and obviously so I'm a son of immigrants, but my mom loved this country. I mean, till the very day
Yeah.
she died. I mean, just this was a beautiful country, had so much opportunity for her. But like her, I mean, literally hundreds of people that I've spoken to, just sheer appreciation for this country.
Yeah, I think when you know how else life can be, it gets a lot easier to appreciate what you have. I the fact that I've been here most of my life, I almost should lose that appreciation. But I grew up with all the stories and all of the history of my family and all of the, just little things that you take for granted in the United States, that just the various freedoms that we
Yeah.
have, just the fact that you could open a small
Right.
business. I mean, all those things. I have part of my family story is my great grandfather owned a bakery in Belarus, and overnight that became illegal. He was shipped to the gulag, and that's the crime of owning a small business.
Yeah.
And here you just don't have to have those same fears and worries that overnight that whole system can change on you, and you could really suffer for it.
Although I have to tell you, I don't know. I think Biden's making an announcement at 2:00 talking about greedflation, all the greedy meat processors and chicken farmers that are obviously all to blame for inflation. They're the
Right.
ones that are really to blame.
Right. Not the printing money. It's that they all decided right now is the best time to be greedy
Right.
and to maximize their profits. Previous years, they didn't want that for some reason.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Back to the immigrant thing. I think I just may have come up with a great immigration program. It's called the Citizen Swap Out Program. So we just swap out citizens that complain here for citizens that want to come, non-citizens that want to come
Right.
here, and just swap them out. I think we'll have a better country that way.
I fully agree. It's hard for me to hear people complain about things in the United States that I think are, some of our greatest assets. Like, somebody said on TV recently, we have too much free speech.
Right.
These kinds of things are, you just know that they were raised in a privileged way, that they never even knew that how lucky they are to have all that free speech. So
Yeah.
I'm in for your program.
Talking about freedoms in relation to the U.S. and COVID, though, you were very outspoken during COVID on school closures and the masking children without science, overall indoctrination. And you actually packed up and left New York and came to Florida. Talk to us about that decision. I mean, you mentioned you grew up in Brooklyn. You're a New Yorker. That must have been a tough choice.
It was. It really was. We had waited kind of as long as we could. We moved to Florida in January 22, but we had done a test run the year before, January to May of 21, kind of just waiting for New Yorkers to get with it and to snap out of kind of what I thought was just this mass delusion where the oldest population were dining in restaurants and living their lives, while children were eating on the ground outside in New York City in the cold weather, and not being able to talk between bites and having a mask everywhere, inside and outside, even long after Fauci went on TV and said masking outdoors is unnecessary. New York kept masking children even outdoors, until when we moved in January 22, they were still masking kids outdoors. That's how, long that went on. And, I have 3 kids. They're 14, 11, and 8 now. So, they were 12, 9, and 6 at the time. And my then 6-year-old, I really saw that he was heading into some serious problems if we didn't get him out. My older 2 could kind of deal with it. They were old enough that they were able to get their point across very easily, but he was a shy kid, and he's the youngest, the baby of the family. And I just saw that the masking was making things far worse for him. And of course, schools had been closed for so long, and it had been open on this sporadic, half part-time program, basically for all of the school year 2021. I needed to get him out. And I fought for as long as I could. I had such hope in New Yorkers. These were my people. I thought these people would never just accept things without any, scientific basis. They would never just roll over and do what the government says without any of it making sense. And another thing for me was I grew up quite poor in Brooklyn. You get to America, you're an immigrant family. My father drove a cab while he studied to be a doctor. Very typical immigrant story. And I grew up in a rough neighborhood, and I knew what being poor was like. And what I saw in New York during the COVID years were all of these rich people either arguing for schools to stay closed for everybody, for public schools, while they themselves sent their kids to open private schools, or they moved to their summer house and sent their kids to this open public school there, or they formed a pod and got their kids a private tutor. And they had spent the summer of 2020 marching for equity, and yet here they were not saying one word for any of the people that I knew were suffering. All the people that I had grown up with who, barely have high school degrees and were sending their kids to public school, they didn't have the options that these rich people who didn't say a word for them had. So I felt for a long time, I fought and I argued and I argued. And the New York Post, to its credit, really let me hit that point again and again and again. My editor, Saurabh Amari, every week I'd be like, Saurabh, I have to write about schools again. The schools are still closed and nobody's talking about it. And it seems like they just forgot the kids. And so eventually I had to get my own family out, but it was a really tough call. I felt like I was abandoning, the New Yorkers that had me speaking up for them. And I felt like I never wanted to leave New York ever. We had just finished building our dream house. We moved in March 2020. We thought that our lives would be in New York. And it's really hard to adjust the picture of where you think your life is going to go. But it was the greatest decision. I feel like a genius every single day. I'm just constantly thinking like, wow, if we lived in New York right now, because the thing was, everybody said, COVID's going to end. Like, yeah, it's going to end. But I saw something that I can't unsee. I saw a complacent people who didn't care about their neighbors, or worse, called the police on their neighbor when there was too many people in their backyard. I just saw a society that I didn't recognize anymore, and I needed to get my family out of it.
Would you say, Karol, it's interesting because I actually was just called the other day by a group that's interested in trying to save New York City. And it involves different folks, business people, politicians, journalists. It's interesting. Do you see kind of the was it more like a Manhattan, like a city thing, or was it all of New York like that? Because it just seems like there's pockets of good and bad in the state.
Yeah. So there definitely are pockets of good or bad. We were living in Brooklyn, but we were living in Park Slope, Brooklyn, which for all intents and purposes is like Manhattan. It's very far left. I always like to say that the worst ideas come from Park Slope.
Okay.
Like all the current articles that you'll read about like polyamory and how cool it is and how it's the latest thing, those ideas originate in Park Slope.
Wow.
So these are the people who put defund police signs up on their $4 million brownstones. And so it was a tough place to be, especially. But for example, my ex-Soviet enclave in South Brooklyn, very conservative, very sane. They never wanted to defund the police. They understand what all of that means. And so you have these pockets, absolutely. And those are the people that I felt worst for. I felt worse leaving them because they were fighting so hard, and they're still fighting so hard to return their city to sanity. So I root for New York. I hate to see it in a bad place. I would love to see them turn it all around. Just thinking about the fact that it took 8 years of Giuliani, but then 12 years of Michael Bloomberg. So you had a 20-year stretch where things were constantly improving. The city had gotten so safe, and how quickly they undid all of that, how quickly it all fell apart is kind of depressing. And it will take another leader, another Giuliani-esque, Michael Bloomberg-esque leader to turn it around. But the big problem is from what I can tell, is that a lot of these insane pockets of places don't want to face the realities of the problems. If you can't face the reality, then you can't solve it.
Right.
So one thing I always say is, like, the 1980s were far worse crime-wise than they are today. But the difference was, and why I had kind of more hope in the New York of the 80s, was that nobody denied it. Nobody said, what crime? What are you talking about?
Right.
Crime? I don't even know. But on the Park Slope groups, for example, they're frequently challenging the idea that crime is bad. They're saying, somebody will say, my kid got mugged outside of the train station in Park Slope, and I'm worried about him walking around now. And people will say that's an anomaly, and look at the stats, look at the numbers. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen that often, and it's happening more and more. So just the idea that New Yorkers are in this like fog where they're not facing reality of what's happening around them, that's sort of where I think they need to start. Maybe an ad campaign to explain that, like, yeah, the numbers aren't as bad as they were in the 80s. But again, that was 20 years of good police work,
Right.
good policy that you just undid in just a matter of a few years. So don't look at it as like, oh, it used to be worse. It's pretty bad right now.
The speed at which things have fallen apart are just amazing. I mean, we've had a lot of small business owners that would, communicate with us about, how things were and how things are today. And quite frankly, a lot of those that could left and went down to Florida were very smart. They just packed up their businesses, but a lot of them can't. And a lot of them are just closing up. And, I go back to the schools and the issues that you've been talking about. I mean, I love ragging on my what I call the devil incarnate, which is Randy Weingarten, the head of the teachers union. But I don't think there's a single person in this world that's done more harm to her kids than that woman.
I fully agree. And the fact that the Biden administration is not held accountable for having her so close to them, they let her rewrite healthcare policy. How can we ever trust anything that they say ever again? A lot of people point to, like, oh, look, the vaccine rates for all vaccines, not just for the COVID vaccine, have gone down significantly. Well, you know why? Maybe it's because Randy Weingarten was allowed to alter CDC policy about opening schools. Maybe people lost trust in these institutions for a reason.
Right.
And maybe it's going to take a lot of work to regain that trust. And we should maybe get going on that. But the Biden administration allowing her into healthcare policy is one of the most repugnant, disgusting, awful things that happened. And she did it, and it harmed kids, and it continues to harm kids. And all the stories I hear, like, kids are really mal socialized. They're not doing well. They're acting out still. And it all comes from that time period where everybody was getting to live their lives except for the children.
Yeah, it's really horrible. Karol, I'm not sure if you know this, but really scary fact here is that, did you know that Randy Weingarten is on the Homeland Security Committee?
Yes, I saw that. I mean, that's a classic example of how trust in the institutions gets broken. Why would Randy Weingarten be on that committee? And it's a politicized, reason. And it's because she's a political ally, special interest group ally, and they give her these kinds of plum assignments because of that.
Oh, but you know what? It makes sense now because parents are terrorists.
Right. Of course.
So now I get the connection.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, Karol, I'm in Florida too, although I was always here. So
the smartest people were always here. Really, you guys, you made it happen for the rest of us.
Yeah, my daughter was in her junior year when they shut down the country. Was it 15 days to slow the spread? Mm-hmm. And then it turned into longer term. Thankfully, Governor DeSantis pushed back and got the schools open. But I think what's not talked about a lot is sort of the damage to kids who had special needs. My nephew is autistic, and my brother tells me it was just online learning for an autistic child was a complete joke. And now he's he's behind, and he already obviously he's going to need care the rest of his life. But those issues are not addressed either. And there's real damage there as well.
Absolutely. So one of the more interesting stories of that time period was physical therapy for kids who needed it was given online. These people go to school for years and years to be able to do these therapies with these kids. And suddenly it was like, okay, we're going to do it online. The parent has to kind of help out and be on the physical side of it. That's not how it works. And the fact is that it wasn't, so Randy Weingarten, absolutely, I see her as like the top of the pyramid of the damage caused to kids. But health organizations, like the pediatrics organizations, they caused so much damage as well. They didn't speak up for kids to be in person. They pretended that it was fine, that they would be staring at a screen for hours every day. They really let down the country. And again, no accountability. I haven't seen anybody apologize or any of that. And the kids who were hardest hit, like you said, the kids with the special needs, they were completely forgotten. And, living in New York and seeing how just we used to say that we cared about these kids, and to watch them just be thrown away and not have any kind of special concessions made for them to say, okay, yes, we understand a virus it might be dangerous, but these kids need to be in person. It was really hard to watch.
Absolutely.
In Virginia, Glenn Youngkin was a big proponent of school vouchers, parental choice, stuff like that. And this is a big movement. In fact, we've gotten involved ourselves and are part of an alliance called the Education Freedom Alliance. I don't think it's ever been more important as it is today to have parents have that choice and the educational freedom so that they can actually do what's right for their kids rather than being dictated what's right for their kids.
Well, I thought that it was a missed opportunity in some places to push that school choice. I think New York, for example, that would have been a great moment for school choice to be a real issue. I wrote about it at the time. But, the rich people had their school choice. It was the poor people that were stuck because Randy Weingarten said so. Yeah. And it really damaged kids who couldn't get out of the system. We moved to Florida for 5 months because I needed my kids in an open school. And I saw that they weren't going to get that in New York. My daughter's school was completely shut while my sons were going on a 2-day-a-week, 3-day-a-week schedule that, when they hit some number of COVID cases in their class, the school would close. And I knew that this was unsustainable. So we're lucky we had the resources to kind of get a vacation rental in Florida and send them to the local public school and get them out. A lot of people just didn't have anything like that. So the fact that the people wanting schools closed also were able to send their kids to, let's say, private schools, and they were against vouchers. I mean, there's no worse trifecta of keeping poor kids poor and keeping them in bad situations.
So, Karol, on that topic, education freedom, parental choice, some of that, you're pretty outspoken on that as well, correct?
Definitely. I'm extremely for school choice, but I also am for reforming our public schools because I just think they need to go hand in hand. And I think in places like Florida, for example, a lot of people feel ideologically safer in the public schools while Governor DeSantis is the governor. A private school can still push, woke nonsense or whatever, and that's it. But public schools are kind of have a stricter guidelines here. So I love the school choice. For Florida has a voucher system now for everybody. But I think we need to reform public schools alongside of it. That's been sort of my thinking on the issue.
Yeah, we're hoping that, the more you can get, the voucher idea, so that the money follows the kid, in place across states, that competition will force the public schools to actually compete for the dollars and try to improve themselves. I know in Iowa that's actually happening. Governor Kim Reynolds got that passed a couple of years ago, and she's saying that now she's seeing advertisements, TV ads. Public schools are saying, bring your kids to our public schools. They're getting better.
Yeah.
That's a great thing, right? Because they're realizing that's the only way they're going to be able to address that. And I mean, when you look at the spending at a public school on a per student basis, I mean, I think New York somewhere over $21,000 now.
Oh, I think it's higher. I think it's like 30 something.
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous.
For the city.
I mean,
yeah.
We have a gentleman who was part of our board that has built private schools in North Carolina and now is expanding. He can get great education out there for like $8,500 a student.
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy to think how much money is just, everybody says we need to throw more money at education. There's plenty of money in the education system. It's just being so misused is the big issue, I think.
Absolutely. It's being misused and that they constantly want more. I hear all the time that, the teachers union's pushing for more spending per child.
Right.
That we've seen no evidence that spending really has done much for them at all. You have places where that spending is really high, where no child passes the state, math or reading exams at all.
Right.
I think we need to investigate why that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll reach out to you later on, but we'd love for you to be part of this Education Freedom Alliance that the several groups have been part of, because our goal is to get 25 states by the end of 2025 to be EFA states. So we're halfway there, I think.
I'm going to switch gears on you on a topic that's been in the news a lot. I know that you went to the southern border recently. Mm-hmm. It's a big issue. We're a small business advocacy organization, and yet we have been drawn into this discussion on open borders because of the crime coming across the border and the economic spillover into our communities. And so we find ourselves talking about open borders and the fact that the president can close the border, has the power to do it, and just hasn't. And so tell us about your trip. What was the experience like?
It was really interesting. I came back kind of depressed about what was going on down there because it was clear that there's no wall or anything that's going to stop this. It has to be a policy change. And knowing that the Biden administration has no interest in making that policy change yet, maybe they will. Maybe they'll look at the election, poll numbers and make changes because things are really bad over there. And I heard from the Border Patrol chief who had recently retired, who was Border Patrol chief in Yuma, and he said that the numbers that were considered a crisis level during Obama administration are now a really easy day for them. It was like once 3,000 people cross, it's a crisis during the Obama administration. 3,000 people now is like a really slow day for them. So we've reached just where every single person who comes across is treated like a potential refugee. And that's really crazy in and of itself. Another thing is, so again, I was born in the Soviet Union. I came here as a refugee. We didn't get on a plane in Russia and just fly to JFK airport and say, here I am, I'm a refugee. Italy gave permission to the Soviets who were leaving to wait there and apply to different countries. We didn't just stay in Italy. We didn't say, okay, now I'm Italian. There was a process and we followed that process. And there are people all over the world trying to follow that process and to come here legally. And they're being pushed to the back of the line because all of these people are getting to the front of it. It was really eye-opening. I know one of the things also that was news to me, you always hear the argument that, we need some level of illegal immigration because we need people to do the jobs Americans won't do. Well, it turns out that none of the people coming across are working in agriculture anymore. That's not something that goes on at the border at all anymore. And to me, that's like one of the largest, arguments that sort of used to shut down the conversation. Well, we need them to pick vegetables or whatever. It's not what's happening there anymore. And the fact is, we don't know where any of these people are going. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know where they're ending up. And that should be a giant concern to people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I read that in New York, there's I think it's $10 billion that they're spending on relocating these families, and they're enticing them to relocate into different areas of New York out of the city,
Right.
with paying their rent for 1 year. And not many of the families are taking it because they don't know where they're going to end up. They don't know if they're going to be able to get jobs. So they're looking at the downside, and they're in the city because they think they can get work. But all I think is, a year's worth of rent. Right now we're in a cost of living crisis as Americans. Yep. People can't afford their rent. Rents are skyrocketing. Mortgage interest rates on mortgages are skyrocketing, and housing is still out of reach for new entrants into the workforce who think, oh, I'd love to own a home. The American dream, and they're going to pay rent for a year on taxpayers.
Right. There's so many just like problems like that. I don't understand how, again, going back to my New Yorkers who aren't speaking up, how are New Yorkers okay with giving these kinds of sums of money to people who broke the law to come here? We have our own people here they're homeless in the street. They're single moms working, 2 jobs to get their kids what they need. And we're just going to hand out cash to people who are breaking the law to come here. It makes no sense to me, and it really is, I think, a damaging way to move forward. I think it entices people to come. They think that the border is not only open, but you also get a check if you arrive here. It's a really bad situation.
You get a check, you get an airplane ticket, you get a cell phone, you get cash.
Right.
It's just like clothes, apartment. My goodness, I think I'm going to leave this country and come through the wall and pick up my reward.
Smart. Yeah, smart.
Yeah, it's really an incredible issue. And like Elaine said, it's something we normally don't comment on, but it's impacting our small business owners across communities all over the country. They have people that are, homeless immigrants that are in front of their storefronts, or there's crime, that's hitting these small stores. And, unfortunately, these are a lot of times, one store proprietor type businesses, and they don't have the ability like a Nordstrom's or a Target, go, oh, well, we'll just close our 6 stores in San Francisco and we'll move on. If one of these stores, you saw this in New York, a lot of, mom and pop shops, had to close because they just couldn't deal with the crime anymore.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. When you hear the stories of these businesses closing in places because of the crime, small businesses just don't have that option. No. And I think that people really need to know that small businesses are what makes the country tick. It's small businesses growing into bigger businesses. It's all of that. And if you cut them off, if they can't survive because of the crime rate, again, we're heading down a really bad path.
Yeah. Like we say, every big business was a small business at one point.
Yep. That's exactly it.
So, but yeah, when we have to do something, we're actively trying to get into this now to have some kind of a solution to at least, it's kind of like an injury. When you have a significant injury in your leg or something, you're bleeding out. What's the first thing they say is you put a tourniquet on it, right?
Right.
To stop the bleeding.
Stop the bleeding.
Before you do anything else. And I think before we do anything else and talk about massive immigration reform and stuff like that, we got to put a tourniquet on the border and stop the bleeding.
Well, Karol, in our last few minutes, tell us about your new book, Stolen Youth, How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation.
I co-authored it with Bethany Mandel, and we present 2 different paths to parents who are worried about indoctrination, not just in schools, but in the doctor's office and at the library and everywhere else. She is the homeschooling mom of 6. I have my kids in a variety of public and private schools, and we kind of show parents what they can do and how they can fight back. For me, for example, I really provide a strong foundation at home so that they go to school and they're really aware of possible indoctrination or somebody kind of giving them their opinion versus facts. Bethany homeschools, and she like pre-screens all of their movies and books. So we have a different philosophies, but we come to the same place, which is protect your children. Your home is your last line of defense.
Great. And you have your own podcast as well. Where can folks go to listen to you? Twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays on iHeartRadio. It's the Karol Markowicz Show. I interview newsmakers and people in public life, but I don't talk about politics with them. I ask them about their successes and their failures and advice that they have for others. Well, that's great. Excellent. Well, Karol, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you all for listening. Main Street Matters is distributed by the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com, and we'll be back soon.